Imagine discovering the ultimate betrayal at the most vulnerable moment of your life. A devoted wife, holding her husband's hand in the ICU, stumbles upon a chilling secret that shatters her world, a secret that involves the very nurse entrusted with his care. But what she uncovers goes far beyond an affair, unraveling a web of lies, deceit, and shocking revelations. Stay tuned, because this true crime story will leave you questioning just how far some people will go to hide the truth. It started with a message, a seemingly harmless ping that broke the stillness of the ICU. Sarah sat beside her husband's bed, her fingers tracing absent-minded circles on his cold, unmoving hand. The room smelled of antiseptic and faint despair, the quiet hum of machines the only reminder that life still clung to him. Her husband, Mark, had been unconscious for days after a sudden heart attack, and Sarah hadn't left his side since he was rushed to the hospital. She believed this was where she belonged, right here, holding on for both of them. The sound of his phone buzzing startled her out of her trance. She reached for it instinctively, hoping it was a message of support from family or friends. But as the screen lit up, Sarah froze. The message previewed on the screen. "I can't stop thinking about last night. Be careful, she's there." Her stomach churned, and for a moment, she thought she might be sick. The words didn't make sense. Last night, be careful. Who could have sent such a message? Her pulse quickened as she unlocked the phone with the familiar code she'd seen Mark enter countless times. A knot tightened in her chest as she opened the messaging app. The name attached to the message read, Lila. Sarah didn't recognize it, but something about the casual intimacy of the text set off alarms in her mind. Lila. Who was Lila? Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through the conversation. It wasn't long before the truth began to unspool in front of her eyes. The messages were unmistakable. Flirtation, passion, secrets exchanged like currency. Each word felt like a dagger, carving away at the reality she thought she knew. Sarah's breath hitched as she read one particular message. "It's hard pretending we're strangers when I see you every day, but it's worth it." Her gaze flickered to the door of the ICU room where the nurse had just entered. She moved with practiced grace, her attention seemingly focused on adjusting Mark's IV. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The nurse's name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Lila. A chill crept up Sarah's spine. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't some distant affair tucked away in the corners of their life. This was here, in the open, breathing the same sterile air as her husband's fragile body. Lila adjusted the monitor, her movements precise and professional, but now Sarah saw the faint traces of familiarity, the way Lila's fingers lingered just a second too long on Mark's arm, the subtle smile that flickered when she glanced at him. Sarah's mind raced. Questions buzzed like static, each one louder than the last. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't she noticed? She wanted to leap up and confront Lila right then and there, demand answers, scream, cry. But instead, she stayed seated, frozen by the weight of what she had just discovered. Her grip on Mark's hand tightened, as though holding on to him would tether her to some semblance of reality. But the reality she knew had already begun to unravel, thread by thread. Lila finished her task and turned to leave, her expression unreadable. Sarah's eyes followed her out of the room, her mind replaying every interaction she'd had with this woman over the past few days. Polite smiles, gentle reassurances. It all seemed so hollow now, a carefully crafted facade that had shattered in an instant. As the door closed behind Lila, Sarah glanced down at Mark, his face pale and serene. The irony was almost unbearable. Here he was, his life hanging by a thread, while the truth of his betrayal lay exposed in the palm of her hand. The phone buzzed again. Another message. Sarah's breath caught as she read it. "Let me know if it's safe to come by. I miss you." Her vision blurred with unshed tears. Safe. Safe from her. The audacity, the sheer boldness of it all lit a fire inside her. Whatever was happening here, Sarah wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. She deserved answers, and she would get them, no matter what it took. Sarah sat back in her chair, clutching the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced, oscillating between fury, confusion, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. She wanted to storm out of the room, find this woman, this Lila, and demand to know what she thought she was doing. But the image of Mark, lying motionless in the hospital bed, kept her rooted in place. There was a time when she would have done anything to protect him, but now? Now she wasn't sure who needed protection, him or her. She opened the messaging app again, scrolling further up the thread. Her breath caught with every new revelation. The affair wasn't just a fleeting lapse in judgment. This was deliberate, calculated. Dates and times were etched into their conversations like a record of betrayal. They had met in secret, late-night dinners, weekend getaways disguised as work trips. Lila had even visited their home, a fact that hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. How could she have been so blind? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening again. Lila walked in, her expression neutral, as if she hadn't just been exposed. Sarah couldn't help but study her now. The nurse was strikingly composed, her movements precise and professional, her demeanor cool and controlled. Sarah's eyes lingered on her for just a moment too long, and Lila caught her gaze. Their eyes locked. There was no flicker of guilt, no telltale sign of unease, just a polite smile that sent a chill down Sarah's spine. "I'm just checking his vitals," Lila said, her voice soft and unassuming. Sarah nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak. Every fiber of her being wanted to confront this woman, to hurl the phone at her feet and demand an explanation. But she knew better. She wasn't going to get the truth by lashing out. No, she needed to play this carefully, to draw out the truth like poison from a wound. As Lila leaned over Mark, adjusting his IV, Sarah forced herself to speak. "You've been taking such good care of him," she said, her voice trembling with the effort to stay calm. Lila glanced at her, her smile widening slightly. "It's my job. He's lucky to have someone like you by his side." The words felt like a knife twisting in Sarah's chest. The sheer audacity of it. Lila, speaking as though she weren't the reason Sarah's world was crumbling. But instead of reacting, Sarah simply nodded, masking her turmoil behind a tight-lipped smile. She watched as Lila finished her task and left the room, the door closing with a soft click. The moment she was alone, Sarah's composure cracked. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at Mark, her mind replaying every interaction they'd had over the past year. The late nights at work, the sudden trips, the excuses that seemed plausible at the time, but now rang hollow. How had she missed it? Or worse, had she seen the signs and chosen to ignore them? Her thoughts spiraled until another idea took hold, one that sent a shiver down her spine. What if this wasn't just an affair? What if there was something more sinister at play? The thought felt absurd, like something out of a bad movie. But the more she considered it, the more the pieces didn't add up. Lila's composure, the calculated nature of their messages, the secrecy, it all pointed to something deeper. Sarah wiped her tears and sat up straighter. She couldn't let this consume her. If there was one thing she knew, it was that she needed answers, and she wouldn't stop until she got them. The night dragged on with an unbearable heaviness. The ICU, usually a hive of quiet activity, felt eerily still as Sarah sat alone, her mind spinning with questions. The phone in her lap buzzed again, and she stared at it, dreading yet unable to resist. She opened the new message, her hands trembling. "You're sure she doesn't suspect anything? I can't keep pretending forever." Sarah's chest tightened as she read the words. She felt as if the walls were closing in, the air too thick to breathe. The message wasn't just evidence of an affair. It was a deliberate mockery of her, of the life she thought she shared with Mark. Every affectionate gesture, every reassuring word he'd ever spoken, now felt like a lie. But what stung most was the question itself. Had she been that easy to fool? Her mind raced as she began to consider her next move. She couldn't sit here, stewing in her own humiliation. If Lila and Mark thought she was oblivious, then she had the upper hand. She could use their arrogance against them. But how? She couldn't simply confront them without proof. She needed more. Something undeniable. Something that neither of them could talk their way out of. With her pulse pounding, Sarah began to comb through Mark's phone. She searched through his photos, emails, even his financial records. At first, everything seemed normal. Mundane pictures of work events, emails about business deals, and bills for groceries. But then she found it. A series of transactions stood out, all made to a single name, Lila Carrington. The amounts weren't small. Payments ranged from a few hundred to thousands of dollars, scattered over months. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized the scale of the deception. These weren't just gifts or indulgences. This was a second life, bankrolled by their shared finances. Each payment was like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of how deeply she had been betrayed. A surge of anger coursed through her, momentarily overpowering the despair. This wasn't just a matter of infidelity, it was theft. Mark had taken what was meant for their life together and funneled it into a relationship built on lies. But why? What did Lila want from him, and why did Mark go along with it? The questions gnawed at her, each one more agonizing than the last. The door creaked open, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. A tall man in a lab coat stepped into the room, his face kind but serious. "Mrs. Carter," he said softly, glancing at Mark's still form. "I'm Dr. Reynolds. I wanted to update you on your husband's condition." Sarah forced herself to focus, nodding as she gestured for him to continue. "His vitals are stable, which is a good sign," Dr. Reynolds explained, his voice calm and measured. "But he's still in a delicate state. It's important to minimize stress and keep his environment as peaceful as possible." Sarah swallowed hard, nodding again. The irony wasn't lost on her. Peaceful. How could she possibly maintain peace when her entire world was crumbling? But she thanked the doctor nonetheless, her voice steady even as her emotions roiled beneath the surface. As Dr. Reynolds left, Sarah's gaze shifted back to Mark. His chest rose and fell with the rhythm of the ventilator, his face pale and expressionless. For a fleeting moment, she felt a pang of pity. He looked so fragile, so defenseless. But then the pity gave way to resolve. Whatever sympathy she felt was dwarfed by the weight of his betrayal. The phone buzzed again, startling her. Another message. This time, it was a voice note. Sarah hesitated, her thumb hovering over the play button. Every instinct screamed at her to stop, to put the phone down and walk away, but she couldn't. She had to know. With a deep breath, she pressed play. Lila's voice filled the quiet room, low and conspiratorial. "I hope she doesn't see this. I can't deal with her finding out right now. You said she wouldn't be here this long." The message ended abruptly, leaving Sarah frozen in place. The words echoed in her mind, each one a dagger to her heart. They had planned for her absence. They had spoken about her, calculated her movements, and used her trust against her. The betrayal wasn't just intimate, it was strategic. Sarah set the phone down, her hands trembling. This wasn't just an affair, it was something far worse. and now she was determined to uncover every sordid detail. Sarah's determination grew sharper as the hours crawled by. The betrayal burned like a fire in her chest, but she forced herself to remain composed. This wasn't the time for rash decisions. If Lila and Mark thought they could outmaneuver her, they were wrong. She would get to the bottom of this, no matter how painful the truth turned out to be. The ICU was quiet, save for the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional murmur of nurses exchanging notes. Sarah knew she couldn't confront Lila yet, not without more evidence, but she wasn't going to sit idly by either. She began piecing together the fragments she had, the cryptic messages, the payments, the voice note. Each clue was a thread, and she intended to weave them into an undeniable tapestry of truth. The phone buzzed once more, and Sarah's chest tightened as she glanced at the screen. It was another message from Lila. This one was brief, but chilling. "We need to talk. I'll find a way to see you later." Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, tempted to reply, to pretend to be Mark, and draw Lila into revealing more. But before she could act, the door to the room opened again. This time, it wasn't Lila. A young nurse Sarah hadn't seen before entered, carrying a clipboard. "Mrs. Carter," the nurse asked softly, "would you like to step out for a moment? We need to change the linens and check the equipment." Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. Stepping out would give her a chance to clear her head, but she didn't want to leave Mark unattended, especially knowing Lila might be nearby. Reluctantly, she stood, forcing a polite smile. "Of course," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil beneath. As she stepped into the hallway, the sterile light seemed harsher, the air heavier. She glanced down the corridor, her eyes scanning for any sign of Lila. To her surprise, she spotted the nurse at the far end, speaking in hushed tones with another staff member. Lila's expression was calm, even pleasant, as though she weren't hiding a thing. But Sarah knew better. Gathering her courage, Sarah approached, her footsteps quiet but deliberate. She stopped a few feet away, her presence unnoticed until she spoke. "Lila," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an edge. The nurse turned, her smile faltering for the briefest moment before she regained her composure. "Mrs. Carter," Lila replied, her tone warm and professional. "Is everything all right?" Sarah took a slow breath, willing herself to stay in control. "I couldn't help but notice how attentive you've been to my husband," she said, her words carefully measured. "It's rare to see such dedication." Lila's eyes flickered with something Sarah couldn't quite place, unease perhaps, or something darker. But the nurse's smile never wavered. "It's my job to provide the best care I can," she replied smoothly. "Your husband's condition is delicate. He needs all the support he can get." Sarah's lips curved into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure he appreciates it," she said, her tone laced with subtle sarcasm. "It's just interesting how well you seem to know him." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a split second, Sarah thought she saw Lila's confidence falter. But then, just as quickly, the nurse regained her footing. "We've spent a lot of time together since he's been here," Lila said evenly. "It's hard not to form a connection with patients you see every day." Sarah nodded, biting back the retort that threatened to escape. She couldn't push too hard, not yet. But she could see it now, the cracks in Lila's armor, the flickers of discomfort that betrayed her perfect facade. It was a small victory, but it was enough to keep Sarah going. As Lila excused herself and disappeared down the hallway, Sarah felt a wave of cold determination wash over her. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. Lila might be good at hiding the truth, but Sarah was better at finding it. This was far from over. Sarah returned to Mark's room, her mind churning with possibilities. The young nurse had finished changing the linens, and Mark lay motionless, oblivious to the chaos unraveling around him. Sarah sat down, her eyes fixed on his face, searching for some hint of the man she thought she knew. But all she saw was a stranger, someone who had built a life on lies she was only now beginning to unravel. Her resolve hardened. She had stayed silent long enough. Pulling out her phone, she scrolled back through the messages and reread them, this time with a clearer mind. She noticed something she had missed before: dates and times. The messages referenced specific nights, some aligning with Mark's supposed work trips or late-night meetings. The pattern was unmistakable, and it made her stomach churn. One message stood out among the rest. "I'll leave the key where we discussed. You know where to find me." Sarah's pulse quickened as she realized what it meant. This wasn't just an affair. They had a physical meeting place, a hideaway for their deceit. Her hands shook as she debated her next move. Should she confront Lila? Call someone for advice? Or should she investigate the message further? Before she could decide, a knock at the door startled her. Dr. Reynolds stepped in again, his expression calm but concerned. "Mrs. Carter," he said gently, "I wanted to speak with you privately about your husband's condition." Sarah stood, her mind still clouded with thoughts of the message, and followed the doctor into the hallway. He gestured toward a small consultation room nearby, where they could talk in private. The room was plain but quiet, offering a brief respite from the constant hum of the ICU. Dr. Reynolds sat across from her, his hands folded on the table. "I want to be honest with you," he began. "Mark's condition is stable for now, but his recovery will be a long road, and there are risks. I noticed earlier that you seemed distracted. I understand this is a difficult time, but it's important for you to be present for him." Sarah blinked, caught off guard by the observation. She wanted to tell him everything, to spill the tangled web of betrayal she had uncovered. But how could she? The doctor's focus was on Mark's health, and she couldn't let her emotions interfere. Not yet. So instead she nodded, forcing a polite smile. "I understand," she said quietly. "I'll do my best." Dr. Reynolds seemed satisfied, though his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as if sensing there was more to her silence. "If you need support, please don't hesitate to reach out," he said. "We're here to help." As Sarah returned to Mark's room, her thoughts spiraled once more. The doctor's words were well-meaning, but they only reinforced her growing frustration. How could she be present for Mark when he had so thoroughly shattered her trust? The irony of it all was almost laughable. Sitting back in the chair, she glanced at the phone again. The message about the key gnawed at her, refusing to let her rest. She opened the browser and searched the address Mark had used for one of his supposed work trips. Her heart sank when the results came up. It was a small boutique hotel on the outskirts of town, quiet, discreet, and far from prying eyes. It was perfect for a rendezvous. Sarah's mind raced. Could the key be for a room there? Was Lila waiting for him even now, assuming he'd recover and come running back to her? The thought made her blood boil. She stood abruptly, pacing the small room as she tried to think. She needed to know, but if she left the hospital, she risked missing something critical about Mark's condition, or worse, running into Lila before she was ready. Her fingers hovered over the phone as she considered her options. Then, without letting herself think too much, she sent a simple reply to Lila's last message, pretending to be Mark. "Where should I meet you?" She held her breath as the seconds ticked by, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, finally, the reply came. "You know where. Room 214. Don't keep me waiting." Sarah stared at the message, her hands shaking. Room 214. It was real. The lies, the betrayal, it all had a location now, something tangible she could confront. Her mind was made up. She wasn't going to sit idly by any longer. If they wanted to keep her in the dark, they had underestimated her. Sliding the phone into her pocket, she grabbed her coat. This wasn't just about exposing the affair anymore. It was about reclaiming her power. And she was ready to face whatever she found. The night air was sharp and biting as Sarah stepped out of the hospital. Her breath puffed out in frosty clouds, her coat wrapped tightly around her as she moved toward the parking lot. Every step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the enormity of what she was about to do. The boutique hotel wasn't far, just a 15-minute drive, but it felt like an eternity as her mind raced with questions and possibilities. The streets were eerily quiet, the city subdued under the cover of night. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she navigated the familiar route. She couldn't shake the image of Mark lying in the hospital bed, his face pale and peaceful, juxtaposed with the words on her phone. Room 214. The betrayal felt closer with every mile, as if it was something she could physically reach out and touch. When she arrived, the hotel was just as she had imagined, small, unassuming, and tucked away from the city's bustle. Its warm lights glowed invitingly against the cold night, the kind of place that promised anonymity to its guests. Sarah parked her car a few spaces away from the entrance, her heart hammering in her chest as she sat motionless for a moment, staring at the building. Her mind flickered with doubt. What if she was wrong? What if this was all a terrible misunderstanding, a coincidence blown out of proportion by her emotions? But then she remembered the messages, the payments, and the voice note. No, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the truth, ugly and undeniable. And she was about to confront it head-on. With a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and walked toward the entrance. The lobby was quiet, the night receptionist barely glancing up from his desk as she entered. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she approached the elevator, pressing the button for the second floor. The soft ding of the elevator arriving felt unnaturally loud in the stillness, and as the doors closed behind her, she felt a sense of finality, as though there was no turning back. The elevator ride was short, but agonizing. When the doors opened, Sarah stepped into the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the carpeted floor. Room 214 was at the far end, the number gleaming in polished brass. Her steps slowed as she approached, her breath shallow and uneven. She stopped just outside the door, her hand hovering over the knob. For a moment she hesitated, her mind reeling. What would she find behind the door? Would Lila be there, waiting for Mark? Would there be other evidence of their affair, proof she couldn't ignore? Her heart raced as she considered the possibilities, each one more painful than the last. But she couldn't let fear stop her. She had come this far, and she wasn't leaving without answers. She raised her hand and knocked firmly on the door. The sound echoed in the hallway, each knock like a hammer striking her chest. For a moment there was silence. Then footsteps approached from inside. Sarah's heart pounded as the door creaked open, revealing a startled Lila standing in the threshold. The nurse's face paled when she saw Sarah, her confident composure faltering for the first time. "Mrs. Carter," she stammered, her voice laced with panic. "What are you doing here?" Sarah forced herself to stay calm, though every nerve in her body screamed to lash out. "I could ask you the same question," she said evenly, her voice cold as ice. "Room 214. It seems significant, doesn't it?" Lila opened her mouth to speak, but faltered, her gaze darting nervously down the hallway. Sarah pushed past her into the room, her eyes scanning the space for anything that might reveal the depth of their betrayal. It was a modest room, but the signs were unmistakable. A half-empty wineglass on the nightstand, a jacket draped carelessly over the chair that Sarah recognized as Mark's. Her chest tightened as she turned to face Lila, who stood frozen by the door. "How long?" Sarah demanded, her voice trembling with restrained fury. "How long have you been doing this?" Lila's lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes darted toward the bed, as if searching for an escape. Sarah stepped closer, her anger boiling over. "Answer me!" she hissed, her voice sharp and cutting. "How long have you been betraying me, betraying him?" Lila's composure crumbled, her face contorting with guilt and fear. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Sarah laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Didn't mean to hurt me," she repeated. "You've been lying to my face every day, smiling at me, pretending to care while you've been— What? Sneaking around with my husband?" Lila's silence spoke volumes. Sarah's gaze burned into her, waiting for answers, demanding the truth. But deep down, she already knew. This wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about everything, the lies, the deceit, the utter disrespect for the life Sarah had worked so hard to build. And now, it was all unraveling right here in room 214. The weight of silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by Sarah's shallow breaths and Lila's nervous fidgeting. The nurse finally stepped back, her hands trembling as she closed the door behind her. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental, closing them into the space where the truth could no longer be avoided. "I didn't plan this," Lila started, her voice cracking. "It just happened." Sarah's eyes narrowed, her fury bubbling to the surface. "It just happened. Affairs don't just happen, Lila. Payments don't just happen. Lies don't just happen." Her voice grew sharper with each word, cutting through the air like a blade. Lila winced, the guilt on her face unmistakable. "Mark said he was unhappy," she whispered. "He said you didn't understand him, that he needed someone who—" Sarah's hand shot up, silencing her. "Don't you dare try to justify this," she spat. "You knew he was married. You knew I existed. And yet you went along with it, played your part like it was some grand love story." Lila's eyes filled with tears, but Sarah felt no sympathy. Not now. Not here. She stepped closer, her voice low and menacing. "Tell me everything," she demanded. "No lies, no excuses. I want the truth, every sordid detail." Lila hesitated, her gaze darting toward the window as if she might escape. But there was no escaping Sarah's wrath. Finally, with a resigned sigh, Lila began to speak. "It started months ago," she admitted, her voice shaky. "He came to the hospital for a routine checkup. We talked. He was charming, attentive, and vulnerable. He said his marriage felt empty, that he was drowning in it." She paused, her words hanging in the air like a toxic cloud. I believed him. Sarah's stomach churned as she listened, her fists clenching at her sides. "So you decided to be his lifeline," she snapped, "to save him from his terrible wife." Lila's voice broke as she tried to defend herself. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "At first it was just comfort, talking, but then he started sending me gifts, money. He said he wanted to help with my mum's medical bills." Sarah's heart sank as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. "The payments," she said quietly. "That's what they were for?" Lila nodded, wiping her eyes. "At least at first. But then it became more. We started meeting outside the hospital, dinners, weekends. He said he loved me, that he was going to leave you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Mark had promised to leave her, to abandon the life they had built together for this woman. The betrayal ran deeper than she had imagined. But there was something else, something that didn't add up. Sarah's mind raced as she recalled the voice note, the messages about being careful. "Why the secrecy?" she asked, her voice sharp. "If he was so in love with you, Why didn't he tell me? Why all the sneaking around? Lila hesitated, her eyes darting away. Because he was scared, she admitted finally. Scared of what you might do. He said you wouldn't take it well, that you might... Her voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Sarah's jaw tightened. So he painted me as the villain, she said bitterly. How convenient. Lila looked down, her guilt palpable. I didn't want to hurt you, she repeated weakly. I didn't want any of this. Sarah laughed coldly, the sound filled with bitterness. Well, congratulations, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed everything. The room fell silent again, the tension so thick it was almost unbearable. Sarah's mind churned with questions, each one more agonizing than the last. But one thought rose above the rest, a chilling realization that made her blood run cold. If he was so unhappy, she said slowly, her eyes narrowing, why didn't he just leave? Why go through all this, hiding, lying, paying you off? What was he so afraid of? Lila's expression shifted, her tears drying as fear flickered across her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time, Sarah saw something deeper in the nurse's eyes, something darker. And just like that, Sarah knew there was more to this story, much more, and she wasn't leaving until she uncovered every last secret. The silence in the room grew heavy, a tangible weight pressing down on Sarah and Lila. The fear in Lila's eyes was unmistakable now, and Sarah seized on it like a predator sensing weakness. She stepped closer, her voice low but relentless. What aren't you telling me? She demanded. I can see it, Lila. There's something else. What is it? Lila took a shaky step back, her hands wringing nervously. I don't know what you mean, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Don't lie to me, she snapped. You've already told me enough to ruin my life. What's one more truth? What are you hiding? Lila's gaze darted around the room, as if searching for an escape. But there was none. Her back pressed against the wall, and she let out a ragged breath. It wasn't supposed to happen like this, she murmured, almost to herself. Sarah folded her arms, her voice laced with fury. What wasn't supposed to happen? Tell me, now. Lila hesitated, her lips trembling as she struggled to find the words. Mark, he wasn't just afraid of you, she said finally, her voice quivering. He was afraid of what you'd find out. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The accusation hung in the air, thick with implication. Find out about what? She pressed, her tone razor-sharp. Lila looked away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. It wasn't just the affair, she admitted, her words tumbling out in a rush. Mark was in trouble, financial trouble. He was siphoning money from your accounts, from his business, from everywhere. He told me he needed the money to fix it before you found out. The room seemed to spin as Sarah processed Lila's confession. Her chest tightened, anger and betrayal clashing with a chilling sense of disbelief. He stole from me, she asked, her voice barely audible. From us. Lila nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks again. He said he had no choice. He was desperate, Sarah. He thought he could fix everything and you'd never know. Sarah clenched her fists, fury coursing through her. And you just went along with it? She spat. You helped him destroy everything we built? For what? For love? For money? Lila's sobs grew louder, her composure crumbling. I didn't know how deep it went, she cried. I didn't know he'd been lying to both of us. He made promises. To me, to you, to everyone. I thought he was trying to make things right. Sarah's breath came in sharp, shallow gasps as the pieces fell into place. Mark hadn't just betrayed her emotionally. He had dismantled their life, their security, with lies upon lies. And now, lying unconscious in a hospital bed, He had left her to clean up the mess. But even as her anger boiled over, another thought pierced through the haze of rage. If Mark was stealing, if he was lying to everyone, then who else might he have crossed? What other dangers could he have brought into their lives? The realization hit her like a blow. This wasn't just about infidelity or financial ruin. This was about survival. Sarah fixed her gaze on Lila, her voice cutting through the nurse's sobs like a knife. "Who else knows?" she demanded. "Who else is involved?" Lila shook her head, her tears blurring her vision. "I don't know," she whispered. "He wouldn't tell me everything. He said it was safer that way." Sarah's blood ran cold. Safer. The word echoed in her mind, laden with unspoken threats. Whoever Mark had tangled with, it wasn't just a private matter anymore. This was bigger than their marriage, bigger than Lila's betrayal. And the thought of what might come next sent a shiver down her spine. Straightening, Sarah felt a new resolve take hold. She wasn't just a victim in this story. She wasn't going to let Mark's choices destroy her life without a fight. She turned toward the door, her voice firm and unyielding. "This isn't over," she said, her words heavy with meaning. "Not by a long shot." Lila's voice cracked as she called after her. "What are you going to do?" Sarah paused, her hand on the doorknob. She didn't look back, but her words were clear and resolute. "Whatever it takes." As she stepped into the hallway, the cool night air hit her like a wake-up call. This was just the beginning.